Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Coach Talk, the show more interested in ideas and philosophy than facts and history. My guest this week is Kabir, who's been on the podcast before, but instead of interviewing him, he's going to be interviewing me. We talked about what you can learn from other things like chess, what a performance department needs, and lessons from other Coach Talk episodes. I'm not going to talk about myself because I can't even bear writing it, let alone saying it to camera, so I'll just thank Cabs for the idea and for doing the interview. If you enjoy this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're interested in exploring mentoring or any of the other things I do to support coaches in the scene, follow me on Twitter where you can find all the other links that you'll need. And now, without further ado,
So, John, what is coaching?
I love this question, as you can imagine. I think it takes so many different, it covers so many different areas. And I do think that what people answer, I would kind of almost add them all together. So I think there is an area of teaching. And by teaching, I would mean you have more knowledge than the person that you're coaching with, and you're trying to get them up to the knowledge you have. But then there's definitely an element of exploring as well, which I think is really important to recognize that you're going to be in situations where you don't know the answer, the person you're coaching doesn't know the answer, and it's about going with them and working it out together. And that applies, I think, a lot when you talk about coaching in a game like League of Legends, maybe more so than in other areas, because so much of what we do is about learning the new thing, what's new on the patch or a new strategy that you're trying to devise or a new system that you're trying to create. So a lot of it is about exploring as well. And then I do think there is a, however you'd call it, mentoring, parenting, support aspect where it's about taking that person on that journey, whatever they need. But then the simple answer, which I like after you've talked about all those things, which is actually I've stolen from Steve Hansen, is that coaching is making something as simple as possible. So I guess adding in my other stuff, it's making it as simple as possible for someone to achieve their goals.
I really like that, and I think in a world where we try and show all our working out, sometimes we lose the value of simplicity. So where are you in this idea of and where what does simplicity in coaching look like for you?
Well, I think it can cover everything that we do really. But the main thing for me is if we come to the game, for example, and your tactics around the game or your systems around the game, the whole point is people should hear them and think, I can do that. You know, your players at least should hear it and think, I can do that, I can execute that. That sounds a lot more simple than when I've heard it before. And the thing that is so useful with keeping this in mind is that's not what we see from analysts or co-streamers, for example. And we shouldn't. I want to make that clear. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. Is that if you are a co-streamer, it's in your best interest to make it sound so complicated that only you have the right answer. Because if I've got the right answer and there's 5 different co-streamers, you would watch me. And so everyone makes their own system complicated enough with their own terminology that means certain things, and they'll kind of act like anyone who uses that same terminology to mean something different is wrong and all that kind of thing. Whereas with coaching, what I want if I'm going through a new topic with a team, whether that's to do with the game or not, is I want everyone to hear it and think, okay, I get it. Like I can achieve that. That's something that I can actually do. So for me, I think if you get into the details, really that means being a bit intentional with how you're simplifying things in terms of the game. I think that if you have a system that covers every single possible scenario with a game like League of Legends, it's going to be ridiculously complicated. If you have one that only covers one scenario, it's not particularly useful. So you need to find a balance where it's like, okay, in most situations, this is the way to approach things. This is the way to think things through. And I think a lot of times it involves going deep enough when we're talking about the game again, going deep enough to make it so that it is simple enough. But that then applies to everything, whether you're doing stuff to do with the game or not. If you want the players be to have a certain culture or to approach out of game development in a certain way or to even go to the gym, the point is you should make that as simple as possible to do. Whether that's providing them with all the tools so they can get the most out of it, which gives them the motivation to then carry on doing it, or it is literally this is what you should do when you go so that you don't have to think about it, then all of that I think is a good thing to bear in mind. And it's almost always like you take whatever you were going to say and ask yourself, can I make this simpler? Over and over again until the answer is no. And then that's a good point to present it.
Okay. Just a question, I guess, for my own clarity, and a lot of people hear the word simple and they tend to look at it as easy or as straightforward. Where do you like align with when you're using the word simple?
That's fine. That easy and straightforward. But I would guess I would say that the caveat would be that it's simple as possible. So as possible is maybe doing a lot of heavy lifting in that phrase, and it might still be quite complicated. Again, if we're talking about the game, it might still be something that okay, you're going to need to have a high level understanding of League of Legends to understand this. But if you had a high level general understanding, it would be simple for you to understand. Because if my audience is 5 professional players who've all played for at least 5 years and have played at the top level, then that can be simple enough. And it will also be based on the groundwork that you've done beforehand. I really believe in being consistent. So, however, the words that we're using to describe things should remain consistent because then it starts to become more and more simple. We're not using multiple different terminology. We all know what we mean when we say a certain thing. And that can, again, keep things simple in the long run. So, yeah, clear, straightforward, all those is the same, but the as possible is maybe doing a lot of work to make sure that this is still applicable, even when we're talking about the very top end of high performance.
Yeah, no, okay, I think that makes a lot more sense to me. And you've mentioned now a couple times of being very intentional with your language, creating shared language. And I know previously you even made a video, a short video talking about the meta message that you're providing as a coach. How do you go about as a coach becoming more conscious with the words you're using and developing this shared language or these buzzwords that mean a lot when we say few?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a difficult one. It takes time and it takes effort and it takes work. It takes time away from the busyness of coaching, which I think is something we often really struggle with in esports. We're so preoccupied with doing the next thing or watching the next league or trying to find the next strategy that you don't take a time to actually reflect on what we're doing, which of course is a bit silly when you lay it out like that and we talk about plan to review. We just skip out the review part on our own work and we do it for everyone else's. So I think just actually breaking down what you're doing and asking yourself why are you doing it, and you can do that in basically any area or anything that you're doing. And that's, to be honest, a lot of what I've been doing this year, these last couple of years with clients, where a lot of the biggest value is simply just having that conversation, having the time to have that conversation of, okay, why are you doing this? For example, recently I've been thinking a lot about review timings. So I was used to, as a lot of people do, you have your competitive games, then you take your day off, then you review the game. And that's okay. And in a lot of sport and academic understanding, these like cold reviews, I think I like the hot and top cold terminology.
Hmm.
Cold reviews have got a huge amount of benefit. There's a lot of, football coaches who will say, oh, I don't want to talk to them now. I want to wait and let it calm down. But then you look at something like the military, and they really do these hot reviews. They have the AARs from Navy SEALs, and that shouldn't say one of them is better than the other, but the point is they both have benefits. And what I had done in the past is I just did the review after a day break because partly I was thinking this is what everyone does without realizing it. That's what I was thinking. And part of it was, well, I want time to prepare exactly what I want to say and I don't want it to be super emotional. But now you can ask the question, okay, maybe we're missing something. What are we missing out on by not doing any kind of hot review? And is there a way to kind of get both, get some value from doing things instantly and actually capturing some of that instant emotion that we would normally have considered unproductive, and allowing there to be a fight if there needs to be a fight? Like, maybe that is something that's useful. And I'm not saying this to tell people to do hot reviews. My point is that's how you would make something like that conscious, where you just ask yourself, what am I doing and why am I doing it? Okay, I'm taking a day before I have a proper dissection of the game. Then I can instantly just take that and start looking online, reading books. You'll find so much information about all these kind of things. So I'm having a meeting with my coaches at the beginning of the week. Okay, what am I trying to achieve in that meeting? What else could I achieve in that meeting? What's the benefits of doing it? What's the downsides of doing it? And that's how we go through and actually make this stuff conscious, as Romain will say. And That then means if it's productive, great, we can repeat it and we can know why it's been productive, hopefully. But also if it's not productive, then we can learn from it. Whereas if we're just kind of winging it and every day is however that day appears to us in the moment, then it's much harder to actually be continually improving. Just like you would say about your players, but often as coaches, we don't review ourselves. So it's the equivalent of just playing games back to back to back without ever stopping and thinking. And if you had a player who was doing that, you would advise them against it. And yet we're often okay with doing that as coaches ourselves.
I really like that because you've struck. There's so many ways we can move forward in this conversation, but I guess the first is a lot of coaches or the status quo of review is take the break after the official, and the status quo is usually correct, and hence why it's the status quo. I really like the way you phrased that. Just reviewing why we align with it or why we don't can give us a lot of fruit. But I want to touch on first a different tangent, and you mentioned this a couple times, but you make it very clear that coaching is this balancing act, and that you have to find the middle ground between being very busy and being still, or reviewing, doing cold reviews and doing hot reviews. I guess part one of the question is what is balance, and then part two of the question is how do you know when you found it?
That's a good question. Not sure I really have a good answer for either of those things. I think that you have to find the right balance for yourself, and it will depend at the stage you are at in your career. I think that early on, there should be a lot more reviewing of your own your own practice to work out what you're doing and why, because it will be as fresh as possible. But for example, the work that I do to bring out a culture from a team, the work that I do with them to get that to come from them, I do review it every time I do it, but I review it probably less. It's going to change less now than it changed at the beginning because I've done it a bunch of times. And so each time it will be changing a little bit less. I don't think there's really such a thing as sort of ticked off now everything is balanced as it should. I think it really depends. I think it during the season there's a lot more you need to do that's just actually needs to be done right now. You have to be a lot more focused on the now. And I think during the off season we should be a lot more focused on the future, and most of us are kind of focused on taking a break rather than focused on planning for the future. But that also then means that we probably have to be less busy during the during the season. I would say that you reach a period of diminishing returns much quicker than people realize when we're talking about just adding on extra hours. I think that we are moving away from this, but the fact that it's still fairly common for people to brag about the number of hours they do, I think that's a bit silly, and that's one of the things that we do in esports because we don't know better. And so I don't think it's a brag that you work a 110-hour week. I think it's actually I think you would be a much better coach if you work less than half of that. And I think you should try and find at least some time to develop yourself during the season and to reflect during the season. I think what happens in esports a lot, there's that book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It talks about doing a time audit with the quadrants. We've got urgent along one side and importance along the other side. And I think in esports as coaches, we are so often dragged about by fake urgency, not even real urgency. And we spend so much time, probably all our time in the season, on the urgent side of things. And sometimes that's important and urgent, but very often it's not that important and it is urgent. So I would say one of the most important things that you can do as a coach is to take some time and actually think and reflect and not be watching something, not be, doing 3 other things and also half taking a break and also half working and nothing like that. Taking some time with a plain sheet of paper or a plain Google Docs if you really don't like plain sheet of paper, and just thinking back of what you've done and thinking about how you can do it better. And I think that's honestly one of the most important things that we can do, but it has like no urgency. You don't have to do it. So that's the thing that people often skip. And I would actually put that, I'm a bit rogue in this. My version of balance is different from other people, but I would probably put that higher than being in game 5 of Scrims, for example. Game 5 is often one that ends up being very much about just micro mechanics and going through the patterns. And if I'm the head coach and I've got an assistant coach, I can say, okay, you run this scrim, or I've got a captain who's, we put in the practices beforehand. I'm not just throwing someone in the deep end. So, right, you run this scrim game, and every game 5, I'm going to reflect on what we've done for the day and reflect on how I performed and what I could do better. I don't think you should necessarily do that, but my point is that when you do a kind of time audit for yourself and you look, okay, how important are things and how urgent are things? I think you'll find that quite often you're not doing the most important things because there's other things that you think are urgent that don't necessarily need to be.
So you mentioned throughout there that there's a level of responsibilities for coaches to go develop themselves. You, as a coach developer yourself, what are some of the best things, the lowest hanging fruits for coaches to go to find developmental value for themselves?
I think reflect is a really big one that we've already touched on. So that it can't happen without any reflection. If you are just permanently focused on going forward and what you're doing, then you'll never, you can't even start. So that needs to be there before we start. Then the next thing that I would look at is, talk to people, listen to people who you like, find people that you respect or look up to, and listen to how they approach things. It doesn't have to be in esports; it can be. But it can be from anywhere. It can be from business. It can be something that's got nothing to do with sport. And just think, okay, um, how can that impact what I'm doing? How can I take that, adapt it, put my own personality in it, and also, mold it to the situation that I'm currently in? And how can I apply that? And I think, I've used this example before, but the Olympic Committee, they released a list of 10 attributes for coaches, and they had, I think they called it a sponge for knowledge at number 2, that kind of lifelong learner idea. And they had knowledge of the sport or knowledge of the game as number 1. And I would say, honestly, in esports, I would probably swap those round, especially in the current climate and the current world that we live in, because there's so much that you can learn, but also the game is constantly changing. Not only is the game changing itself, like every 2 weeks we get patches, but even in esports where the game isn't changing, there's not set enough strategies that have been around for long enough that we can say this is the best way to play. And so every month or every few months, you have to be adapting to the new strategy, the new way of doing things. And so being able to be constantly learning, I think, is really important. And that is a skill that you can develop. So start with reflection. Then for me, the best thing is listening to other people. I love reading, but it's taken me a long time to actually get good at reading. And these last few years have helped that a lot. But listening to other people that you enjoy, and start by being led by your curiosity rather than saying, okay, the best thing I could do is listen to other League of Legends coaches because they're right in my field. Don't worry about that yet. Start with what am I actually interested in? Okay, I like chess as well. Fine. Watch chess coaches talk about chess. And as you're watching, just approach it with a critical eye, having reflected on what you do and say, okay, what do they do that's different from what I do? Do I want to adapt what I do, or do I actually disagree with what they're doing? All those kind of things. And, you don't need to make it really difficult. You can start with things that you're passionate about, that you enjoy, that have nothing to do with what you think might be relevant. And then you'll find that quite often they are. But even if they're not, it then becomes easier to do the next thing. So over these last couple of years, I've been able to spend so much more time developing myself, but also just exploring ideas around coaching, and it just snowballs so easily. Like, I'm now more passionate about finding out more things about coaching, and I remember them better, and I can dissect them a bit better because it's practice. I've done it more and more. So that would be the kind of pathway that I would lay out. So it starts definitely with reflecting and working out, why am I doing what I'm doing? What am I actually doing? Then it's listen, watch, find whatever the easiest way that you take in knowledge in an area that you like, and then gradually make it all the other ways as well in areas that you think are probably more useful, but start with your curiosity.
So I think I completely agree. And I think I wish more coaches had that same mindset of just being curious, because I know the saying is obviously curiosity killed a cat, but that's never been true. Especially for such an up and coming industry in esports where we don't really know what the best coaching practice looks like yet. Um, from my knowledge of you, John, you've been also really interested in rugby and chess. What are some of the biggest learnings from those two domains when coming into esports and coaching within it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not specifically just rugby or chess. It's kind of all sport, really. Because since I was very little, I was involved in lots of different sports. Never to like a professional level or anything like that, but kind of, I guess I would say, to a competitive level. And I loved just kind of taking things apart. And that's probably what led me to coaching, but also definitely what led me to something like League of Legends, which you can just endlessly take apart. That's why I loved it so much. In terms of lessons directly from stuff like rugby or chess, or the other big one is stuff like cycling. That's another one of my um, main sporting passions. Although I am interested in a lot of different things, it's actually kind of hard to pin down some concrete examples, because so much of what I do is just an amalgamation of all the people that I've looked into and all the people that I respect and taking parts of their practices. So it's kind of everything I do is related at some point to these things. I think one thing that is a direct concrete example that I've done with teams more recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, is thinking about tactics and strategy from chess, which I think is an important one, because I also think in the West we are awful at strategy when it comes to League of Legends, and also awful at strategy when it comes to performance as well. But that's a different topic, where it actually originally started because it was about communication, and we wanted to make sure, at one sense, we weren't all on the same page, and in another sense, we were over micromanaging each other. And so trying to work out, okay, when is it okay to micromanage and when is it not? When is it okay to say whatever we need to say to make sure we're on the same page? And when is it better to just leave some silence? And that's the distinction that we had. So if we just take, I mean, I'll explain it very briefly. If we just take, in chess, tactics is based on the current state of the game. There's a forcing move or series of forcing moves that give you an advantage. So either material advantage or checkmate or even positional advantage. And then strategy is about the future state of the game that you're going towards. And that's, I think, pretty much a direct correlation to League of Legends. The colloquial way to describe it is tactics is knowing what to do when there's something to do. Strategy is knowing what to do when there's nothing to do. I think that's quite a nice way to put it, even though obviously chess is a turn-based game. So when it's your turn, you've got to do something. And you can actually see players who are very good tactically and worse strategically. And the more I've looked into this idea, the more it actually has been helpful. I think a lot of teams that are very good in practice, in scrims, but aren't very good on stage, is actually because of this. It's not so much dealing with the pressure, it's that they're bad strategically. But in scrims, there's always something to do, because someone is always overextending and it's just a much faster paced game. And so you don't have these moments where it's like, okay, how do we force the thing we want to happen to happen? And so when we're talking about strategy, that's really the idea that we're thinking about. So we have a front to back composition. Okay, great. But how do we make a front to back team fight happen? That's the part that's difficult. And actually, that's the part that I think we're not very good at in Western League of Legends. And that goes beyond the simple one. The front to back might be the simplest, but where are our power spikes? What timings do we need to make something happen at? And when that happens, how are we going to make whatever that thing is happen? And I think it's really important where, especially in ERLs, you build a composition. Let's say, again, we'll keep things as simple as possible. We'll build a front to back composition. Then we get to the late stages of the game where we would win any 5v5 that's front to back. And for a long time, we can't make anything happen, even if we have a gold lead. And then the enemy engages on us. We win the 5v5. We win the game. Great. Good job. We needed to have a team fight. We got a team fight. We won. But they were the ones who made it happen. That's a situation that occurs quite a lot. And so you might not realize that you actually have this massive area of weakness. So that's been a thing kind of directly from chess. But like I say, I think all my practice is based in something that I've heard or seen. I don't think, maybe I've come up with the ideas only in the fact that I've combined two things from elsewhere that haven't been combined. But I don't think there's anything really original under the sun. So I think it's completely fine to just steal from everywhere.
Yeah, my physics teacher in school used to say, um, reading other people's work is the best form of cheating, because all it does is it helps you either confirm or deny your own
Mm.
ideas. And I think your
Yeah.
You've become a melting pot of
Yeah.
everyone else's ideas.
There's a quote, I think from Picasso or something, where he's saying, "Good artists borrow and great artists steal." It's a good,
There you go. You might be
good way
the
to
best
describe
artist
it.
there is. It in the similar sense that you as an individual is a melting pot. Our rosters are melting pots of different individuals coming together to perform. But there's also a lot of people behind the scenes helping them. What are some of if you were to map out what a performance division should look like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting topic to think about for sure, and I think my opinion on it has changed quite a lot in the last kind of few years. I think the way that Simon Cox talked about this kind of thing, I think, is really, really useful. You have to be very careful with confusing things that are just nice to haves with things that you think are essential. So his example is, if you want to get in shape, all you really need is a pair of running shoes. And, to be honest, technically, you could argue you don't even need those. Everything like a gym membership and all that kind of thing, which might be quote unquote crucial for a lot of people, is actually just a nice to have. You don't need that to get in shape. So what I would say is that if we look specifically at League of Legends, but I think it does apply to broader esports as well, you need some kind of leadership and structure. And then, to be honest, almost everything else is a nice to have. I would say you need some kind of leadership and structure, and you need some level of game knowledge. I'm always cautious about adding that extra one on, because it's stuff like Duke said it, GoToOne said it, Max said it, that okay, the tactics of the game don't really matter, the game doesn't really matter. And I think the same, but I'm well aware that all of us have been coaching at the highest level, like for like a high level, for a long time. And so it's very easy to say, I say and have said in the past that I could coach a League of Legends team without talking about any League of Legends, and I think I would still be useful. But I don't think I could do that without knowing a lot about the game. And so I would say there is some sort of base knowledge. I don't think you need to know more than your players. I don't think you need to know a huge amount. I don't think you need to be challenger or anything like that. But those are the things that I think are actually essential. Some sort of leadership and structure, the most important thing. And then a base level of knowledge. And then beyond that, I would say everything is a nice to have. And proper deep knowledge of the game is my first on the list of nice to haves, but actually not essential. And I do think that really understanding the game and being able to explain the game simply is important. I won't touch on kind of every single skill that you would need to coach, because there's going to be just so many. So I'll kind of touch on positions. So some real leadership, some in-game knowledge of the game, I think would be the second one that I'd be kind of looking for. And to be honest, maybe even after that, it's the broader alignment and the longer term strategy, which I think, again, is completely missed in esports. And then I think it is important to consider, of course, out of game stuff. But again, I would be very specific around that. What exactly are we doing? What is it actually gaining for us? And what is it costing us, both in terms of finances, but also in terms of time? And I think that's something that I've kind of shifted my opinion on. I'm, coming from, I guess you still say coming from a sport background, although it's been so long that it seems a bit of a weird thing to say, but having a lot of interest in sport, where, of course, physical conditioning, all that kind of thing, I'm very aware of how impactful that is for mental performance and for League of Legends as well. And there was a time where I would almost get those people on board and then let them kind of run riot in a way, let them do whatever they saw as best. And actually now I would probably be a bit more specific with it. And I don't think it's a terrible thing that people want to see how your work on nutrition is actually helping us, because it's important to make sure that what we're doing is kind of really paying off. Because, okay, fine, we had a physio work with the players once a week, and none of the players had any injuries or took time off for any injuries. Sounds great, but also how much time did we spend doing work with the physio that we could have been doing with other things? And if there had been no injuries anyway, then actually we're just kind of losing some time. So yeah, it's getting a bit confusing, but yeah, leadership I think is the most important. Then in-game knowledge of the game, then looking at out of game knowledge and kind of operational stuff. The reason that I think even operational stuff is actually just nice to have is because I think that is something that you can do as the leader, but it's better to have someone else do it. And then also, yeah, the whole kind of staff alignment and longer term strategy, I think, is really, really good. But most esports teams don't have that or care about that at all. So people are brought in for a 1 year contract. And even in the industry, there's some people, especially people who maybe don't have experience or knowledge of how any other area of the world works, who kind of think that the head coach is responsible for the direction of the team. And if the head coach has been brought on for a year, that's just not the case. If you've been brought on for a year, the direction of the team is do as well as possible in summer, because that's how you will be judged on if you should get another job. So you don't have a choice to decide that direction. And I do think that we should go the way of a lot of different sports. And I don't know actually if it's just because people are being more public around the people in these positions, or because it's the position I want to do and I'm looking into it more, or because it is actually changing, that these people are becoming more important. I think it's probably a combination of all of those. But that person who's I'm currently looking into the Springbok story, just absolutely loving it. So, for example, Razi's the director of rugby. He's not the head coach. That's the position that I think is completely missing currently in esports. That person who has both knowledge of performance, but also is in charge of the longer term strategy. So that's a bit of a mess. There's kind of a lot of different thoughts out there. I think the main thing that I would say is it is worth, when you're setting up a kind of performance division, to be very specific around what's actually necessary and what's just a nice to have. And a lot of the nice to haves, we trick ourselves into thinking that they're completely necessary. So I think places that have one coach, if that coach is providing like leadership and structure and direction and getting everyone to buy in, then it can work. And if we add on to that some game knowledge, and we add on to that someone to take care of operations, and then we can also add on to that, another tier down, people to be focused on the out of game stuff and all that kind of thing, that can be great. But it starts with the structure and the leadership and the having someone for everyone to follow almost.
Yeah, I think it's really important because I always look at coaching staff as like gears in a system, and it's really hard to have a functioning system when you're changing the gears every year. So having this constant piece at the center in this director of esports positions, so to say, could be really valuable. When if we jump into like fantasy land for a second here, let's say John, you get to pick whichever team ERL. Let's put it in ERL because they're probably a bit more constrained. Um, what do you do? What's like the first week, the first month for you as a director of esport for any
Yeah,
an ERL
I,
team?
I think the first step is to work out the direction that the company wants to go and the organization wants to go, and to actually take a lot of time to really work out what that is. So, what is a player or a person for your company? Like, what are the kind of things that we want them to embody, and what actually is our goal? Because I think what a lot of teams do, based on experience, but also on what I see, is the goal isn't really ever explicitly stated. And so it becomes place as high as we can with the money we decide to spend. And the money we decide to spend might even flex week to week, or at the very least month to month. And so what tends to happen is that we not quite flip a coin, but we can use that to really hammer home the point. We flip the coin every year and burn it all down at the end of the year, and then flip another coin next year. And if it goes well one time and we get heads, we say, "Oh, we're developing, we're doing things well." And if it just goes poorly a bunch of times in a row, then it's like, well, we're struggling. And I think either way, like if you every year you just build a new roster, you get a new coach, you build an entirely new set of systems, it's just you're just starting from scratch over and over again. And so you have organizations that have been in leagues, even big leagues like the LFL, right, which is a prestigious league to be a part of, and they can say, "Oh, we've been there for 5 years or 6 years. We've got 6 years of experience." It's like, they've done 6 years one time. They've just done the same year over and over again, but with like an entirely new set of people. So I think for me, working out really what our goal is, honest internal goal, like what kind of thing are we achieving? If we are spending the 6th most in the league of 10, we should not be internally thinking that we're trying to win, because the best roster wins in almost all situations. But do we want to be developing talent? Do we want to be focused on trying to actually sell players to the LEC, sell players to bigger organizations? In which case, okay, we're going to have to set up contracts in a certain way. We're going to have to get used to setting up contracts in a certain way. We're going to have to focus more on identifying young upcoming talent and more on the systems that develop that talent when it's in our organization, and less on getting the best players. And could there be some players that we identify that would be good mentors themselves? Because so much of the teaching that happens on a League of Legends roster is from the other players. You know, the best way to make a rookie AD carry great is to put them with a good support who talks to them a lot. Not necessarily talks in game, but talks to them a lot. And there are a lot of players now, with the way that the ERL structure has gone, or, you know, with a wide professional tier 2 now. There are multiple leagues where you could make your career in ERLs, which didn't used to be the case. But that means that there's plenty of people with a huge amount of experience, names that we recognize from the last 10 years at the absolute top level of Europe. And maybe some of those are willing to have that actual honest conversation and be like, look, we're not a roster that's going to try and win, but what we want you to be is someone who's going to help develop people. And maybe you get a percentage if we sell people to bigger teams. You know, you can do anything like that. So I would work out what the organization really wants as a goal. What are we actually aiming for? And then start to look at how we might get there in the kind of longer term. Work out a timeline, work out what our steps are and how we're going to evaluate those steps. So, okay, if the goal is in 4 or 5 years to become the best team, let's say it is, and we don't have the biggest budget, but we've got a large budget and we've also got this longer timeline. How can we leverage the longer timeline to overtake the teams that are just spending loads? So there are plenty of teams that can come to mind that I won't name, that just outspend everyone every year, and they place first, second, or third, and say it's great because they're first, second, or third, but they're spending, you know, it's not worth the money really. And so finding that kind of thing, I think, is really important. And if you are a team that's wanting to spend the most and win, you can then approach it in a different way. But having that clarity, I think, is really, really crucial. And that would be my first step. And then the next step for me is to work out the coach that I would want to bring on. Now, for me, of course, because I've got a lot of experience as a coach myself, and that's what I've done. I've never done this role. It doesn't exist yet, but I've done the coaching role. What I would need from a coach might be different than what someone else does, but work out exactly what you need, again, based on the goal, and go and find that coach. And I do think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in the way we interview people and the way that we scout. But you need to, again, have that coach bought into the idea that you're trying to do, you're trying to achieve, and that can flex on who you think is the best. So the best coach for developing young players is probably not the best coach for we want to get a bunch of great players and win. Probably not. I mean, maybe, but there's not. I don't think there's just good coach and bad coach, and we just get the best coach, and that's the way to do it. It's the best coach for the project that we're trying to build. And I mean, in terms of coaching, I mentioned this recently when I was talking to Grant as well. In terms of coaching, one thing that I've been thinking for a while is, because we don't have good interview and scouting processes for coaches, it would be something that I would explore, would be a sort of trial period type thing. I'm not a big fan of this idea that we seem to do in the LEC, where we give people long contracts, but those long contracts have no security. And so I won't say who, but there was a coach who was signed to an LEC team based on 1 or 2 days of trial scrims, where he had to lead trial scrims for 2 days, which I think shows nothing about your coaching ability. And then the players picked the coach of a bunch of people that they trialed with. And then that coach was given like a 3-year contract straight away. And then after 1 split in the LEC, they were exploring whether to get rid of him. And after 2 splits in the LEC, they did. So what was the point in this longer term thing? Whereas what I would say is, firstly, I would do a very different interview process, and I would hope to get it to give me the best result possible. But I would say to that person, look, we want you for a year for now, but either verbally or even in the contract, after that year is done, we'll talk to each other first. And if that year goes well, and I can see from how you are that you will fit what I'm trying to achieve, you will fit where we're trying to go as an organization, now we can talk 3 years, whatever, 4 years. Let's build a plan together of how we're actually going to achieve that. And so that's why I think you need to have someone who's kind of focused on that longer term. And in the LEC, I would even do it as short as a split. Sure, you've got 3 splits in a year. You can use one of them as your trial. And I think there's plenty of downsides to it. And I don't think it's a perfect system by any means. And there could be coaches who are kind of turned off by it. But I wouldn't be cocky enough to think that, I can interview people well enough to just know that this will work out in the long run. And I don't want to be changing the coach if I can at all help it. And I think if you're someone who's running a project, you should absolutely see any change you're making as a mistake, but especially changing the coach is a mistake. And I don't mean it's a mistake to change your coaches. I want to be very clear about that. I mean that if you bring on a coach and a month later you're changing him, there is a mistake somewhere. Either it's a mistake to get rid of them now, or it was a mistake to hire them in the first place. And more often than not, it was a mistake to hire them in the first place. So you need to be learning from those mistakes. You need to be changing your systems around hiring. But the goal should be to keep things, in an ideal world, which is never going to happen. I want to build a group and just never change them because they're all the best in the position for us. And the chances of you getting that is very, very low. And the chances of them remaining the best player in the position or best coach in the position for us are also pretty much zero. But that should still be the goal that you're aiming towards, regardless of the compromises that you have to make.
Yeah, I think we as humans hate change, but there's so much change in esports. It's kind of hard to build really. I think just over that little conversation there, I picked out 2 very very key themes. I guess if I could summarize, it's this idea of one being aligned, both internally, just within yourself, and then with all the other agents, whether it be your players or the higher ups. And then it's a matter of, is this person or is the thing we're doing appropriate for what we're trying to achieve? So it's alignment and appropriateness. Those are 2 very, very good ingredients to build a very good performance unit. What are some of the missing ingredients around that to build this really beautiful dish that we're trying to build?
I mean, I would even argue that appropriateness is based on alignment as well. So they're even very connected. And again, if we take Razzie as an example, that's what he says is his main role is alignment. It's about getting everyone aligned. Now he's obviously dealing with a massive structure. Technically, all of South African rugby reports into him, although he spends most of his time with the Springboks, of course. So I to be quite honest, I'm trying to think of anything that actually, again, is not just a nice to have beyond that. I think if you have, okay, you could say talent or something like that. I think if you have everyone aligned in the organization, everyone pulling in the same direction, and you have talented people, that's all you need. So, the job of this person, and something that I see as my job, even when I'm there as a head coach, is I want to get the right people and I want to get the best out of them. And basically, I want to stay out of the way. I want to get the right people and give them the space to do their job right. And I think if you do that, that's it. It's just not simple, and it does need to be constantly being looked at, and we do need to be kind of constantly pushing forward in the right direction. But really, those are the only things that are absolutely, I think, a necessity. So it's almost a cop-out answer, but I would say maybe the only thing you need is alignment. You need alignment, and alignment includes the way that we approach things and the attitude that we have to high performance. You need alignment and talent, and then I mean maybe that's it. Get a bunch of talented people all lined up behind a goal. You're in business. Nothing else matters. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree to an extent. I just every time we try and build alignment, there's points and pockets along our journey where we break out of that alignment. So I guess the question becomes, how do you recognize when you're aligned or not? And then what do you do when you fall out of that line or fall away from that
Mm, mm.
straight line trajectory that we always try to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's almost like that's where therein lies the rub. That's the difficulty of it. That's the day to day of a position like this. There is actually stuff to do every day to make sure that this is the case. I love that Alex Ferguson thing where he said, I think in an interview at one point, if you ask the cleaner at Old Trafford, he'll say, "I'm winning the treble." That's the kind of thing I think is worth having in mind, where everyone in the organization needs to know what the goal is, what the values are, and they need to be brought into it. So for me, one of the values, or one of the things, it's not maybe not really a value, but one of the things that I would want to try and get from the culture is this idea of marginal gains. And for me, how that is in practice, there's lots of definitions of it nowadays. How it is in practice, how we know when we're experiencing it, is anyone could go to anyone and have an idea, and the first response would not be a kind of cynical one. So Brailsford, when he was describing this, was like, well, when I joined, this was talking about British cycling, when I joined, if I went into the mechanics office and said, I'm not sure that wheel is 100% straight, guys, they would probably say, piss off, Dave. Like, our job is the bike, your job is the whatever you do. Whereas now they would be like, oh, great, like an opportunity to look at that, an opportunity to get better. And we need to build that environment where we're accepting of mistakes and we're all constantly looking for the next edge. So if you're the social media manager and someone comes to you and says, oh, have you thought about doing this? Like this could be good. It's not that we have to do everything. And I think the better way to describe marginal gains in a sentence, not when we're not talking about the culture, we're just talking about the idea, is that nothing is too small to be considered. It's not that we should do everything. But the first response shouldn't be piss off, basically. And the same applies in a team. And I think it's unbelievably rare. If someone comes to me as the head coach, if I was in that role, and they say, I really want to do Soraka Jungle, my first response should not be, that's stupid. And honestly, it's mostly that's stupid and let's ignore it. Or someone comes and says, a topical example recently, someone comes and says, Aurelian Sol has a ridiculous win rate in solo queue. And I can pretty much guarantee you that all professional teams talked about the fact that Aurelian Sol seemed unbelievably strong in solo queue, and yet no one played it for months until Chovy played it. And it's because the first response was a cynical one. Oh, it's just Aurelian Sol one tricks. It's not a good champ. It's just one tricks driving up the win rate. Actually, it turns out it's been nerfed like 3 times in a row since then, and it's still okay. So that kind of cynicism, I think, is a really crucial one. And so if people aren't demonstrating that in behavior, then that's where you can see that you're out of alignment. So working out making sure that everyone knows what the goal is, but also what kind of behavior is expected from X org, whatever org it is. What kind of behavior are we wanting? And then the first time you see anything that's not in that behavior, you have to do something about it. I think that there's the quote from Ben Ryan, which I really like, which is, you become the first standard you walk past. The first time you let something slide, that's the standard that you become. And so you have to just be really rigorous with it. You have to just love the grind of keeping people to that standard. Now, when I say keeping people to that standard, I don't mean you should go and shout at them. In fact, I think the first port of call should be, I should go and listen to them. That should always be the first thing. Okay, why has this happened? What's going on? Is there something going on in your personal life and that kind of thing? Because you do have to be aware of that. You do have to consider that. You do have to consider if this is like outlying behavior or it's going to be a new pattern. But people need to know how important it is, and people need to know how crucial it is and how it's not what we're looking for. And then you do have to be kind of ruthless, I think, if you're in one of these positions, especially if you're in a position that's, you're not, you didn't get everyone bought in before they even joined. You're coming in somewhere new. I think you do have to be quite ruthless. You just have to say, look, you're not going to fit in with this culture that we're going for, and we have to get rid of the dead weight is too strong a word, but you have to trim things down if necessary. And yeah, we'll do slightly less things for a while, but it's better to have those spaces, I think, than to have people who pull in the opposite direction, because one person pulling in the opposite direction can ruin it for a lot of people, and can really bring that kind of culture down. And if it's, you know, someone who's just constantly complaining and constantly approaching everything in a really cynical way, it will spread to people around them. But luckily, the opposite is true too, where if you have high performers, they make everyone around them better, even if they're not doing the same job as you. So even if that's the social media manager next to you, who you can see is just constantly smashing it, constantly looking for the next edge, always on, finding um, the new things, teaching themselves new skills to get better at video editing or whatever it might be, that actually makes you perform better, even if you've got nothing to do with social media. And yeah, like I said, the reverse is true as well. So I think, yeah, making sure everyone is clear on the goal, defining what kind of behaviors, what do they actually mean, and then as soon as you see anything that's not aligned with those behaviors, you have to be on it straight away. And that's the really kind of crucial thing.
Yeah, it's like I think it's the All Blacks with their no dickheads rule, right? It's this
Yeah,
idea of you don't want someone anchoring the ship, because
yeah,
even if they anchor it for a day, you might be 10 kilometers short of your destination,
yeah,
and then now you have a hole in your ship and you've sunk.
yeah,
That's the last thing you want. And I also love this idea of no opportunity is too small to consider,
yeah,
because I used to go to theater school when I was growing up. And if I didn't make it into esports, or if I didn't find sports, I would actually probably done theater. And one of the first things we learned was we should approach every scene with not yes but yes and.
mm,
And it's this concept of we acknowledge what's being said and we try and build it. And
mm,
then if we hit a wall, we hit a wall, and then we can come back to the start. But always go until the wall, or try and find where that wall is, and then we can decide: are we happy with the wall being here, or do we want the wall further, closer, whatever it may be?
yeah.
I
I love
think
that.
these nuggets of information are so valuable, and you've done something amazing. Is that you've made about 20 episodes of these. So not every day do we get the chance of getting the podcast host as the podcast subject. So over all these episodes, I guess we can go in chronological order. What are some of the biggest takeaways? And let's start with Duke.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much from all the people. So whenever I say this, it's not the only thing that you can take from it. It's more just what I've kind of taken from each of the episodes. The thing for Duke, firstly, I definitely want to redo one with him, because I've now so much more experience of talking about it. And now whenever I watch it or watch parts of it, I want to ask questions that I didn't ask at the time, which I think will always happen, and I hope it always happens. I hope I watch back every single episode and think, "Oh, I could have done that better," because as soon as you think I nailed it, then that's a worry. Um, the thing that I love is it's not what makes you win; it's what makes you busy. I think that's such a good way to describe what we were talking about before, where just these urgent things so often are just nonsense. And so I think in that sense, he was talking about people who feel the need to be challenger or master to be a coach. And in certain roles, maybe it's useful, but mostly it's what makes you busy, because I've got to play a bunch of games and that takes a lot of time. And that's not actually the best way to learn anything about the game. And it's not actually the best way for any other reason. I think there are good reasons to play enough and watch enough of the game, but I don't think mostly people are doing it for those reasons. And they're kind of doing it because they enjoy it as well. And that's fine. Like I might enjoy watching the LPL in the morning. That's great. But then I should have it down as this is my recovery time. This is my enjoyment time. This is not my work time. And so I'm not telling anyone that I work from whatever it is, 7 till 9, because I spend 2 hours watching the LPL. I might occasionally gain a little bit from it, but I also might gain a little bit from anything else that I might do. So I think that's a really, really important one from Duke that I think is really good. But I will say as a caveat, I need to be. It's very difficult to not be caught up in this. What's it called? The burden of knowledge, or whatever the Steven Pinker way of saying it is, where I say that having coached for a long time at, in the LEC or in the top like ERL ones, and that's only because I was like lucky enough to be involved early on. I always say that as a caveat. It's only because when I was there, it was anyone could anyone could do it, and how I coached back in time, I would not be a proponent of nowadays. So I do think that's a really good one. where we have to be careful about what makes you busy and what makes you actually win. And there's a Tim Ferriss quote, which I love, which I saw recently, which is busyness is just another form of laziness. It's lazy thinking and indiscriminate action. And I think that's such a good way to think about things, because there are coaches who I would say 80% of what they're doing is busy work. And it could be that they're getting enough from it and the 20% is good enough that they can still be effective. But to be honest, it's not good in the long run. And this idea that we have to sacrifice everything to be a good coach, I think, is actually the opposite of what's true. And I think learning to prioritize and learning to get the most out of different situations, I think, is or most out of your time, sorry, is a better way to go about things.
I think, I mean, I agree, and I think we've reached this age where we see a lot of these like entrepreneurial influencers. You got to be up at 5 so you can do this by 7, and I think there's merit to it, and there's obviously days where you need to be that way, and there's moments and phases in your life and your career where that gives you a lot of fruit. But I think especially in coaching, where there's 100 different leads you can chase,
Mm.
some of them will just not give you any good fruit.
Yeah. I think there's not only 100 different leads you can chase, but there's a book which I read recently, which I really like, which is The Tough Stuff, it's called, and it's 7 hard truths about being a head coach. And one of them is you're hired for your brain and your ability to make decisions. And so anything that you do that's affecting that is the worst thing that you could do. And so not only are we being distracted by this busyness that's inefficient, we're maybe under prioritizing recovery and things like that so that you can watch CB LOL. And it's like, guys, this is ridiculous. You are hired. The value of a coach is your ability to make decisions, basically, to communicate ideas and to make decisions. And so the first thing that goes if you don't sleep properly, you don't take care of yourself, you aren't healthy, the first thing that goes is your ability to make decisions. And we're seeing that in sport, where the younger generation of coaches coming through, or even now the middle generation, I guess, depending on the sport, are much more focused on, well, I need to go to the gym and I need to sleep right and I need to eat right, because I need to make that split second decision and I need to be attentive to everything. And if I don't sleep and instead spend time learning tactics and stuff, then it ends up being counterproductive rather than just less efficient time. And so again, if we take Razzie as a good example, the night before the World Cup final, the first World Cup final, they didn't do anything to do with the game. And it was almost like a story that they didn't do anything. It was just like, no, I just saw my friends and we just talked. We didn't even talk about rugby, really. We just talked about life and just because all the prep is done and you have to just say, right, I can just keep going over this over and over again. But it's better for me to be on my game tomorrow than it is for me to get a couple of extra hours of quote unquote work.
Yeah, it's like it's the same when you're 10 minutes before your official, and it's like everyone's like, "What's the draft plan?" It's 10 minutes. We discussed this an hour ago. There's no point. The more we talk about it, the more doubt we let seep into our lives. And um, one of my old coaches always told me, Kabir, if you ever feel like you're really busy, think of it like you're standing in shallow water. If you're running around, you can't see the bottom because you're kicking all the mud up. So sometimes you just need to stand still, let the mud relax, and then you can make a really, really good quality decision because you can see all the shells, you can see the fish.
I love
It's
that.
really hard to catch the
Yeah.
fish if you can't see them.
Yeah, I love that. It's really interesting as well. As you were talking originally, I was thinking, you're right. All these like entrepreneurial influencers who are just constantly about this hustle culture. Wake up at 5, get my 60 minutes of direct sunlight, and then have my caffeine and all this kind of thing. And I would say one of the first, if not the first, kind of entrepreneurial influencer would be someone like Tim Ferriss, and one of his most famous books is the 4-hour work week. It's like, how do I do as little as possible and still achieve results? So I think that's quite an interesting way. It hadn't really occurred to me until you were just talking about it. But I don't think we should strive to do as little hours as possible, but we just shouldn't measure our output on hours. And most people don't even know how they might measure their output because they haven't taken the time to stop and the water is just completely churned up. I love that analogy as well.
So then moving on to episode 2 with Robert Yep out in NA. What
Mhm.
was your favorite learning? I guess saying best learning is a bit inappropriate here.
Yeah.
So what was your favorite
Favorite's
learning from
good.
that episode?
Yeah, favorite's good because it's really interesting as well. Because some of these I went back to relook at, mostly because I had too many notes to come into a conversation like this rather than because I had nothing. But when I rewatch it, it might be different than when I thought at the beginning. So there's so many to take from all of the other things. I love his idea of you just take 1 point. Like, let's, again, keeping it simple as possible. Like, if we're trying to learn 5 things, that's not simple. We just take 1 point. This is the most important thing. And actually kind of thinking beyond that, and why don't we do that? I think quite often we don't do that out of fear. Because if you decide we're only going to take 1 point from this game, and this is the point that you'll have to get, if you've taken the wrong point as a coach, that's on you, you know. Whereas if you just talk about everything, then it's like, well, I did cover that thing that ended up costing us the game. Whereas if you are a lot more specific with it, the more impact you have over the practice, the more you have to be right about the impact you're having. Otherwise, it could be bad. And I think people often aren't used to that. So I like that. Take 1 point. I also like his way of describing something that I think we kind of all know, but it's not the best thing that's the best thing. It's the thing that you can actually do that's the best thing. And I like that, where we should just, theoretical is important only in how much we can do it. And it's the same. I actually talked about this before, where I think I was talking about, I can't remember exactly, maybe the chimp paradox, that kind of idea, the Stephen Pieces, is it? And someone was asking me, you know, what do you think about the fact that, you know, there's more modern research on the brain that shows that actually it's more complicated than that, and this and this. And I don't really care what's true or not. I care what's useful. And it's the same when it comes to the game. I don't really care what the theoretical thing is. I care what's the most useful for the game. So that, I think, is a good way to approach things, and definitely something that stuck with me from that conversation.
I think it wasn't mentioned on the podcast, or at least I don't believe it was, but I'm a big fan of Rob, and we've had a couple conversations. Something he's mentioned a couple times on his social media and in conversations is sometimes even when you do things correctly with the right intentions, it might not give you the outcome you want, and that's okay, and that's part of the job. I think a lot of coaches get hung up on, I drafted correctly, uh, you know, you know, we've played this draft before, we've practiced it, we knew this was our game plan, and we still lost, and they get so caught up in that emotion. But sometimes that's just life, and it's just
Mm.
dealing with that as well is pretty important.
Mm.
So, third, Samchaka. I hope I'm
Yeah.
pronouncing that
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah. I mean, one thing that I kind of took from everybody gradually, and also something that I've had to learn an embarrassing number of times. But the main one from Sam is that you have to listen to your players. You have to really listen, and you have to really build that connection. And it's not about you have to be friends with them, but you do have to build that connection. It's not optional. And I think something that I've done in the past is players that I maybe haven't got along with as well, you have to put more effort in to build the connection. And again, I don't need to be friends with this player, but I need to do certain things so that I actually understand you, understand where you're coming from, and I can empathize whether I agree with it or not. And that's a really big one for me from Sam. That's just the most crucial thing. If you're a coach, you have to listen to your players. You have to understand. And of course, you know, you can tie that into, I can make it simpler for you because I understand you and all that kind of thing. But really, again, if we're talking about importance versus urgency, I think one of the things that's not urgent and is the most important is to really know your players.
What's the low hanging fruit? Because in my experience, it's sometimes a bit hard, especially because both
Mm,
of us, we come from that traditional sporting background. It's
mm,
easy to get to know your players when you can talk to them on the touchline while they're playing, or
mm.
they come to practice early. You can kick a ball about between them. We don't get that same experience in esports for a lot of us coaches because we're
Mm.
working
Yeah,
virtually. So how do we do
yeah.
that?
And that's, I think, you know, separately, that's why being in person is so important. And I also think that's maybe why we undervalue it nowadays in esports. It used to be for a while that everyone was in person, but that was often to do with the LTR rules. So, for example, we could compete in the UK even though we had no UK team players because they were all living in the UK. So that's why gaming houses were useful. But I think when you have gaming houses and people don't build that connection, you quite often don't see the value in them. And I think it's true that a remote scrim block is actually almost as good as an in-person scrim block. So if you're comparing the price of being in person and the price of having a team that's remote, then it would seem a bit silly. But what you miss out on is all those tiny little moments where you chat, where you find out about them, where you have dinner together or have lunch together or whatever it might be, just consistently. You're not doing it as one big thing, but just while you're going to the shops, you happen to go together or whatever that might be. Those things I think are really, really crucial. And that's the thing we miss the most when we're online, because you have to schedule that and suddenly it's harder. But that's where I'd say you have to realize how important it is. And I would schedule that over scheduling other things. And I would just make sure that it has to happen. We have to talk. We have to regularly meet up, and we have to just do things. Again, it's not about the most efficient way to build connection with someone is not necessarily to let's all play team builder games. I don't mean that. I don't think we should necessarily do that every single day or anything like that. But just ask them really proper questions and be open and vulnerable yourself and expect them to do that as well. And that's how you should kind of go about it. But one of the things I think is a great way to start is to do a proper in-depth interview with everybody. And there's something that I used to do privately and I hadn't considered until Romain was talking about it, that I should just do that in front of everybody else. And also like ask the questions. I mean, some of my quickfire questions are actually stolen from what England football do, which is hero, highlight, and hardship. And just those kind of questions where getting people to be open and honest with each other and getting people to be vulnerable and talking about things like, okay, where are you from? Like what was growing up like? Like, did you enjoy school? Like, and what are the kind of films you like? All those kind of things. And then you can even actually, I've done this with one of my clients, just look up questions that build connection online. And there's a bunch of really interesting questions there that can give you some starting points. But the main thing is that you just need to actually do it. And that's the part that we often just don't do. And I've been definitely guilty of that myself as well. And something that really learnt from Sam, or really just, it drove home again, something you hear it over and over. And it's something that I've known academically for a long time. But every time I'm distracted by the things that are urgent. And now I wouldn't do them. I think it's more important for me to know, let's say we're doing 2 blocks of scrims, 3 break 3. I think it's more important for me to know my players than it is for me to come to every single scrim, every single afternoon block kind of thing. And that's an extreme thing to say, and hopefully I can do both. But my point is that if you have to give up one, be careful what you're giving up. And I would say that connecting with your players is one of the most important things that you can do as a coach, just full stop.
Yeah, I think wholeheartedly agree, right? Like you're gonna face some hardship and difficulty, and if you know your players, you know exactly how to talk to them to get them out of that little dip or that slump or whatever that team might face. And when you miss a line, it's you know exactly how you need to approach them. You know the things you need to say to get them to buy back in, or how to give them ownership. But that only starts when you build that relationship. All that trust, that compassion, that respect, it starts only after you've built a relationship. It doesn't come and then the relationship after. So I wholeheartedly agree here. Moving on to Watson.
Yeah, I think one of the things that kind of came from this conversation that I've actually used over and over again since is that there's a few times I can't remember who sort of said it first. I don't know who to credit with this analogy, but this idea that we have so different positions in a game of League of Legends, and yet the way that we teach is like bringing everyone together. It's like if you had an orchestra and you wanted to learn a piece, you just all play together, which would be ridiculous. You have to go and split into your individual parts, you get it up to a certain standard, and then you come back together. And that's a good analogy to bear in mind. But I do think there are kind of not some problems with it, but we actually, from the conversation with Watson, we kind of took it another step further, which is that the thing there is that if you're the coach or the conductor in this case, you have to know what you're playing. You have to know the music that we're playing. It has to be consistent. We have to know what we're trying to achieve in this practice for everyone to be ready. And I think something that I think is definitely true is that a huge percentage of games in practice are ruined by people just not knowing their role in the team. because not only is it your team that could do that, but the enemy team that could do that. And I don't mean people making mechanical mistakes. That happens. It's nothing we can kind of fix until we get to play against AI or whatever. But it's just, my role in this time in this game was to peel, and I engaged. So I'm Alistar and I engage rather than I peel. Or the example that we used before, I'm on the team that shouldn't want 5v5 front to back team fights, and I engage a 5v5 front to back team fight. And so we lose the game. And that's not a mistake in that you made a mechanical mistake, although quite often people will look at that situation and look at how we could have mechanically played it better. But instead, it's just not knowing your role. It's like not knowing your part in this big piece of music. And so the thing to say is like, okay, we should focus more on individual work, which I think is true. And we should work on team stuff in an individual context. So what is your role in these certain team competitions and stuff like that? But the thing that came from the conversation with Watson, aside from just a bit more clarity on this whole thing, was, okay, but that would mean that you would need to know what you're playing, and it needs to be consistent. Because if we teach everyone how to play, I'm just using these as simple examples, but if we teach everyone how to play front to back competitions, and then we all come together and I draft a poke comp, then that's like everyone goes away and learns their part to one piece. We come back together and I say, right, we're playing a different piece, and you've got the same problem but worse, because you've also lost the time that you worked on it individually. So again, it's a great thing to bear in mind, this thing of we should make sure that each person knows their part that they're going to have to play. But if you are going to go that way and you are going to work on things individually, you have to be even more prepared as a coach to make sure you're playing the right piece once the game actually starts.
Yeah, I think the orchestra analogy is really, really crucial, right? Like you don't see the violinist try to play the notes of the cello, and sometimes we see that in scrims, right? We try and see people try and, I guess, as cruelly as it is in esports, be that main character
Yeah.
when they don't need to be.
I mean, it doesn't even necessarily need to be that. I just mean with the orchestra analogy, the point being that the most effective way for an orchestra to learn how to play the same piece is not to all come together and all play, because it will distract you from your part because someone else is getting their part wrong because it's the first time they played it. And if you suggested to someone who's a conductor, say, you have to learn this piece that no one's ever played and you have to do it all together, it would be ridiculous. It's a ridiculous idea. Everyone has to go and practice their own part individually, get their own part to a certain level, and then we come together and we work out, okay, this is too loud, this is too fast, this is too, any other things that you might need to change. Whereas what we do in League of Legends is we all are learning how to play together as a team, and the only thing we do is we come together and we play. And the downside is that people mess up their individual parts, which then impacts everyone else. So our top lane dies level 1 because he doesn't realize in this matchup you can't all in level 1, and so goes for it and dies. And now suddenly the whole game is different based on this thing that probably should have been done individually. And that's a little bit like it's decision making more often than mechanics. But it also happens when we come to like team comps. So we all should have been peeling for our AD carry, and the AD carry is playing as if everyone's going to peel for them, but no one does. So we all lose, and we don't get to actually practice any of the team thing because we didn't individually go through what is your role in this team comp, what is your role in this game. And I think that's something that we kind of underutilized but also undervalue. So it's not necessarily that we're trying to play each other's parts, although that is it's a big problem as well. And part of your role is knowing how supportive you are and how much of the main character you are, how demanding you should be. Ironically, you often get the problem the other way as well, where the people who need to be more demanding don't know that their role is to be more demanding. So it's more about just the way that we practice. But like I said, the thing from the conversation with Watson is that if you are going to do this, if you are going to have people practice individually and then come together, the thing they practice individually has to be the thing that you practice together, which is harder than it might seem to make sure you're consistent with what music we're going to play.
And how about Callum?
Yeah, I mean, Callum, I think the thing that was so great about that is there was just a time, there'll be timestamps in the video where it just gives a bunch of practical things to deal with tilt. And I love I love these like deep conversations. I mentioned philosophy in the intro every single episode, but practical things are always good. Like, what can I actually do? And so it's like, okay, you can breathe in this way and you can focus on these things. So I think the main takeaways for me from the one with Callum is just practical things to deal with tilt, for example, practical things to focus on when you're doing your breaths or whatever that might be. And I think that's just really crucial as an easier one to just make sure you have in your toolbox to just remind yourself of that little section of the podcast every now and again.
Yeah, in my experience of working with Callum, I'm the ideas guy usually, and it's always fun to have my little spiel. And Callum goes, "Yeah, okay. So what does this look like practically?" So I'm not surprised that his
Mm.
podcast and anytime he speaks, he's a practical hose, I would say.
Mm.
Gevous, I think personally that was one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. So I'm very curious to hear what your takeaway was.
Great. I think this is another one where there's a lot of takeaways, but a really big one for me, which not something that he actually said, but just the way he is. I think just really like don't be afraid to be yourself, like embrace who you are.
Mm,
And so he's like, okay, look, the spirituality stuff is really important to me. And there are plenty of people, probably myself included, especially in years past, where you would kind of not ignore important areas of yourself, but almost have them as like separate rather than just let's fully embrace it. Like the way that I'm going to be the best is to be the best, be the most me. And I think that one is really, really crucial. And I really, really love that. And there'll be players that he just gets way more out of than anyone else because he does that, because he embraced that side of things. And to hide it might feel more might feel easier, and maybe for certain players that might actually be better, people who are a bit more cynical about all that kind of thing. um but that was a really big one for me. Rather than anything specific he said, just the whole thing of like, just don't be afraid to really embrace who you are, I think is a great takeaway. And then there's just so many other so there's other practical things, but that one is the kind of main one for me.
mm. I think you somehow have an ability to read my mind because that's what draws me to that podcast so much. It's just Jeeves is unapologetically himself, and I think being authentic as a coach is so important because your players know exactly who you are, they know exactly who they're speaking with, and I think that helps that relationship building process be a lot more smooth, a lot more efficient.
Mm.
Then I guess someone arguably the most experienced coach so far to be interviewed, Simon Cox.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I already talked of the other stuff, the nice to haves. That's had a big impact on me. Um, I also love the fact he sort of identified very specifically our biggest problem in esports is it's so hard to measure improvement and measure how far we're going. So I talked before about you find your goal and you work out the steps you're going to do to achieve that. And you can have steps like we're going to identify the goal for this year or this split mainly is to identify the best head coach for the position. So that's why we're going to do this trial period and all that kind of stuff. But it's hard to say what percentage are we off, especially in a game like League of Legends, which is snowball based. You could be 1% worse and it looks horrible, or you could win and you're actually worse. There's so many different things. So working out, I mean, obviously that's true in other sports, but just even more so, working out what that might be, I think is a really good one. Um, and yeah, I mean, the thing with nice to haves and essentials, the better way to describe that in this context is just don't forget the basics. And again, as you know, I love the marginal gains idea, but sometimes we're so obsessed with getting that 1% that we miss out on the 99%. And I
Mm,
think that's an important thing to to bear in mind. Is make sure, and to be honest, actually, it's not the sexy part of it, but when you look into what they actually did in British cycling or what they actually did in these other organizations that have publicly embraced this marginal gains idea, they do the basics right first.
mm,
And that is the marginal gains first are with the basics. Like, okay, how can we
mm.
do these things that we've done 100 times? How can we do them a bit better? And that's the first step rather than I want to bring in a sport hypnotherapist to make sure my players get over tilt. I mean, that might be a great thing to do, but make sure you don't forget the basics first.
Yeah, I mean, you can't reach marginal gains unless if you don't cover most
Mm,
of the journey, right?
mm,
That's the whole point. And if the basics cover, let's say 60%, then you have 30% attributed to, talent, sheer hard work, and the emergence of new systems through that process. Without that, you can't even reach
Mm.
marginal gains territory. So I think that's really, really important. I'm going to pair up Pat and Mac together because they've been
Yeah,
the coaching duo of the decade. So I assume they've overlapped in much conversation.
yeah. I actually that's good
So
because I had done that because I also interviewed them like I think pretty much back to back days maybe, and so they do. It's not that they blend together, but they do. It was kind of felt more like one long conversation that I was having with both of them. Um, I love the way that they work together, and they have that clear boundaries, clear responsibilities, but also the trust that there would be plenty of teams who and plenty of groups of when I say teams, I mean like teams of coaches who wouldn't be really open to the idea or would struggle with the idea that they're going to have different days off because they trust that the other one's got it covered when they're not there. I think that's really good. Um, so that they know that they don't have to be at every scrim because the other person's got it. So Pad can do scouting in everyone else's off day, so that Matt can start scrims knowing exactly what's coming up next. Um, I love the bank analogy. When you with your relationships, you have to every time you have a big argument or a fight, you're withdrawing from the bank. So you also have to deposit in the bank as well.
mm,
And that we're talking about building up the connection. It's kind of that there as well. I mean, they have a maybe slightly different approach to me in that they do focus more on like we should be liking each other as well as being just connected. And I think that can be great as well and provides a much nicer environment, which is often gets the best out of people. And so their boot camp is not learn about each other; it's learn to like each other. I think is a very good way of approaching things as well, and just making the relationships conscious. I guess is what it is, rather than just everything else. You say, okay, look, you had this massive blow up, this massive argument. You are kind of withdrawing from the bank. So let's make sure we put some more back in later, and you guys have to work it out and talk about it and do something together afterwards. I think that kind of thing is really really good.
and then the most eclectic Western manager,
Yeah,
with Roman.
yeah. I
What's
mean, yeah. I mean that
takeaway
one's
there?
kind of easy in a way. I'm just going to pick the obvious one, which is make it conscious. It's something we've been talking about the whole time. I think that's just a good way of thinking about it. And like we said, if you want to develop yourself as a coach, that is the most crucial first step. And you should be everything we do should be on purpose. And it's so often not the case. Where that's one of the big things that I do now is that I basically am just asking people like kind of why are you doing that? Not because it's bad, but I just want to hear why. And so often they might have a reason, but you can tell when they talk that it's the reason because it's because what everyone else does. And we mentioned before, like inherited wisdom. I can't remember exactly the phrase you used, but inherited wisdom is often the best, or the main way is often the best. And I think that can be true in a lot of areas, if not almost all areas. But like I mentioned, I was coaching since 2013 or whatever, and there are things that I saw why they started happening that now happen because that's the way we do things. But like I wouldn't do anything like I did. I wouldn't trust. I know the people who made these things what we do, and I wouldn't I wouldn't trust them. So I think making it conscious is just the big one, and almost the key to everything really. That's how you keep getting better as an organization. That's how you keep getting better as a person and as a coach. And that's yeah, if you can sum up all of coach talk in 3 words, it's that: make it conscious.
Make it conscious. Okay, that's it. I'm gonna get that put up above my computer now,
Yeah. Yeah.
just so I remember it for the rest of my life. Then we move on to GoToOne.
Yeah. I like I really like his talking about optimizing time and space as a way to um, lay out the role of the kind of leader that we spoke about before. So that person who I think is the only person that's actually necessary for a coaching staff is that someone who's optimizing our time and optimizing our space, and laying out a structure like that. And I think that's a very good way to do it, clear way to think about it, so that you can then start to put a value on things where it's like, okay, how is this actually, it's not just how is it making us better, but how is it optimizing our time, I think is good. Again, when we're talking about physio or whatever that might be, I think physio is a bit of an easier one because it's very difficult to do when we're talking about movement and stuff like that, because it costs us time, but it also makes all the rest of our time better and all that kind of thing. So I think that's a big one for me.
In this age of optimizing, does optimizing always just mean seamless fits, or because like you've just said, you could go out of your way to go meet a physio,
Mm.
but that could be the optimal thing to do.
I think for me, optimizing, I just think of it as I don't think it will ever be optimized. I think it's just a process of trying to make it better. So the other way to say that same thing is like your job as the leader of a group, as a leader of a team, a leader of an organization, depending on what position it is to improve the way we spend our time and improve the space that we spend that time in. I think that's maybe the way that I'm at least sort of seeing it and interpreting it.
Mhm. Then we have our in-house ERL expert, Mr. Veteran.
Yeah, I think again, I like. I mean, it's so interesting to talk to someone who just has so much of a knowledge across the ERL scene, and a kind of new, a very clear but also quite different way of approaching a lot of things. I think for me, he really nailed down the importance of a schedule, which is something that I've found for myself, but hadn't really ever, not forced onto a team, but prioritized on a team. And actually, looking back, the players that I think I got the best out of and were the best players to have around were also the people who had already done that for themselves. And it's great to hear someone who knows a lot more about the ERL scene than me say that's actually not uncommon, because I would have guessed, and I actually asked, my guess was that's actually surely really uncommon. But especially with these kind of newer generation of players who started playing professionally during COVID or since COVID, where we're a lot more online. I think that's a really good one to bear in mind, and a good one to work on, where that if people have a structure for themselves, then it will be infinitely easier to first get a structure that all works for all of us in terms of how we are optimizing our time, but also improve it where it needs to be improved and work with them on it, on what they need and what else they can do to basically be the best.
I think that's really really interesting because I personally, in my own personal life, I'm a big schedule hater, but um, coming into coaching, especially in esports, it's so important to impose some sort of rigid schedule, just because people forget where they need to be, what time they need to be
Mm,
somewhere, and even then they might not be conscious about I need to be at a scrim in an hour.
mm,
Do I go play a solo queue now? Do I go take a break, get some my food, my,
mm,
my rest? Do I do my own prep work for that scrim block? In case like
mm.
I typically send my players like this is going to be the focus of the scrim block like an hour, 2 hours before the scrim, and let
Yeah,
them read over it so they can come in with the right mindset. Um,
yeah,
do one of those things, and
yeah.
sometimes that's forgotten for the player.
Yeah, and I think schedules can be very useful for sort of building the discipline as well. Um, there's something that the most recent episode that I just filmed, which will be coming out this week, it is with Martina from Overactive Media, and she was saying no one has any willpower at 11 o'clock at night. So if you want something to happen in the evening, you have to schedule it. It has to be in the schedule. Like, this is the time when I go for a walk or something like that. Like, you can't just say, okay, by the time I get there, I'll work it out. And I think that's really important too, as well, where you can use them to kind of build some sort of discipline. And how it works in practice could be very different depending on the people. Some people, I like Google Calendar, where I can just see it. Also helps when I'm scheduling meetings and stuff to know I've got other things going on. But maybe that's not for everyone, but they have to have something that works for them and that they can actually show that they consistently do. And that, I think, is a great way to differentiate if you are choosing between the last two players in a certain position. That's, I think, a great way to differentiate it, which Veteran was talking about, which I think I really buy into.
Mhm. You can completely skip this if you want, but I chronologically I'm
Yeah,
next,
yeah,
so you can either go
yeah.
to me or you can jump to Lars.
No, I liked it. I think we were talking about player run scrims, which I think is which is a great one, which I think is a really good takeaway and something to explore. I do think, I can't remember, this is the problem, is I can't remember if it came from the conversation that we recorded or any other conversation, but making sure that whatever you do, so if it is player run scrims, it's not just you rock up one day and you tell someone to do it. It's like, we're going to lay the groundwork of how this is going to work. You go through it with the person, what you want from them, what you expect from them, and do that kind of thing so that you can either take a step back and still be at scrims, or even go and do something else that's really important, but isn't something that's sort of urgent, isn't something that like has to be done. So I think that can be that's a really, really a big one for me and a great takeaway.
Perfect. Yeah, I think I wish there was more player run scrims, kind of like that interrogation room kind of style where
Mm,
you let them run the scrims and you sit behind that one-sided window and you just observe how
mm,
they act, what they do without the coach supervising them.
mm,
Sometimes taking that authority away can let players just be
mm.
their most authentic self and can just
Yeah.
change
Yeah,
the
you
mood of a
see things
training
that you
environment.
wouldn't otherwise see, and that's crucial to find those details, because when the game starts, you're not there anyway. So they might well come out in the pressure situation of a competitive game.
Mhm. Then we had Lars.
Yeah, I think again, like so much, and I've since read his book as well, which I can definitely recommend. I really like his structure when he's talking about culture, which is quite different from the structure that I use, and also quite different from the structure that Romain uses, although we're trying to get to the same place. I like this focus on a dream rather than the goal, and making sure we get emotion into it, because emotion and the story is what kind of people buy into. That's actually a separate point of something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And then the other thing is that it's really interesting to have a conversation with him about this hot versus cold review timing kind of idea, because he's a psychologist. He's worked a lot with sport, but also has a military background. And so he's actually been taken, he does both, but not mostly, but originally, because he's just directly taken stuff that they did in the special forces and also stuff that they do in sport. So he's like combined both just from his own experience. So he has his capture straight after the game, and then also a review when everyone's cooled down, or a hot wash up straight after the season ends, and then also a detailed, in-depth, colder review later as well. So the combination of the two, and it's really interesting, because it just so happened that I was reading and learning and talking about that with people, and then he came on the podcast and I was like, oh, this is a perfect person to ask. And then he started talking about it before I even asked him. It's like one of those situations that all kind of blends in together. But yeah, I think that's a big one for me. So, oh, the last thing as well, they mentioned it right near the end, but a focus on followership rather than just leadership, I think is important. So how you follow, and working with people on how they should be led rather than just working on the leaders. And I think that's something that I've really missed in the past, where I've been a lot more specific about introducing a captain and having them have specific responsibilities and working with them a lot on those responsibilities, but not working with other people on how they should work with the captain in the team, and how they should be the best follower that they can be, rather than just working on leadership.
Yeah, I think all of that is super important. I think Lars is such a unique member within our esports ecosystem, coming from such a different background.
Mm.
We then have Edward. I think I can say outright this was my favorite episode to watch. It's just the most personable one so
Mm.
far.
Mm.
So I would love to get Edward round two. Just putting that out
Yeah,
there.
yeah, maybe, yeah. I think that'd be really good. Um, Again, it's just about which one to choose. I think something that he does that's very good in terms of just practical things is that whenever he shows examples from other teams, he takes away nameplates,
Mm,
because it's something that I hadn't realized until we had that conversation. But so much of the time as a coach, and I did this myself, you use other things to add more weight. So T1 are doing this,
mm,
therefore you should look at it better. And that's okay, but it is a shortcut, and it does damage you in the future. And again, saying that as someone who has done that. So you have to be very specific if you're using someone from your own field, what you're doing. And actually, it's something that Clive Woodward talked about a lot when he first took over at England. It was something like no Northern Hemisphere team had ever beaten a Southern Hemisphere team in any game, let alone in a World Cup or an important game. And he's had made a rule where they were going to stop looking, because they used to just say, okay, this is what Australia do, this is what New Zealand do, and therefore we'll do it. And he said, we're never going to beat them if we are looking at them. And
mm.
I think it's, if we could find a situation to look at them and not know that we're looking at them, then that would be great, which you can't do in rugby, but you can do in League of Legends. So nameplates off, we just use the ROFL file. We don't show who's playing who. Is this play, this is a play that works because I can show it working. Or let's dissect it and you can tell me it's terrible for what this and this reason. But I think that's a really big one. And coaches often, they show like this is what G2 do, and then they also don't really have a defense if a player has a problem with it. And player says, actually, I think they made a mistake here and here. And the thing quite often that I've had people tell me is like, and then my player had a problem with it, but it's what G2 are doing. And it's like, so it could well be wrong. Like they make a lot of mistakes. It's the way the game works. So of course they're still the best team we have by a way. But I think that idea of just taking nameplates away, I think it's a difficult one because also you have the nameplates. Even if you get rid of them on the champions, you'll have them on the side of the screen. But I would actually consider, I do a lot of messing about with OBS so that I can show people only the things that I want to show them. And I would probably make a new scene where I actually just have hidden all the nameplates as well, where I just like, we're not going to look at this, guys. So we're just looking at the game, and above the champions, it just says the champion name, and you don't get to see where it's from. And someone might recognize it, but at least you're taking that thing away of constantly just taking the easy way out and say, you don't have to listen to me because I'm right. I don't have to prove that I'm right. I just tell you this is what the LPL does. And I think that's why even in the LEC, we just copy what they do, which isn't the way we used to play when we used to be a lot more competitive. Not necessarily those things are linked, but I do think it's important. And actually reminds me, another thing that taking away from Veteran, as well as the scheduling thing, is that if you want to learn about something, follow one team's whole progression. Don't just follow what they are as the best version. So for example, T1, probably potentially the best team in the world at playing around Baron. But that T1 roster, it was a meme because they were bad at it. And then it was a meme because they did it a lot and they overdid it. And now it's almost a meme because they're so good at it. So look at when they first started to take Baron and they were just the best team by miles and they would just throw games by trying to take Baron. Look at all of those stages. And when you look at them, take away the nameplates and see how they've progressed and what they do now that they didn't do before and how they've actually learned it. That's how you find out about something. So that's kind of Edward reminded me of what something else Veteran said that I really like as well. So I think that's the big one for me. So being cautious, don't just take the easy way out where you say, I don't have to argue about this. I don't have to prove this. I don't have to work out the reasons because I can just say the best team do it. But then the downside of that is that you're always just copying someone else. And you're always, when you come into a game against them, that is going to be there in their heads, So I think there's a lot of value in finding mirrors in emergency situations and getting people to buy in because of that. In an emergency situation, I mean, Mac talked about that with the Mad Lions roster, finding BLG and just copying and mirroring them. Not that they would have won anyway, but what happens when you play against BLG? Like it's tough. So yeah, I think that's the biggest one for me from Edward's conversation, but it was a great conversation to have. So there's loads there.
I think that's so good, especially because we see a lot of players emulate their game to an LPL LCK star, and I've done this before, where I had a player who was hell bent on doing exactly what this other player do, same champion pool, whatever. And one day I just showed him the VODs of that player and nameplates off, and the whole time he's going, "This guy's griefing, this guy's so bad, this guy's griefing." And I told him, "Hey, by the way, that's your idol." And then he realized like, okay, cool. This guy can be good, and there's no point that there's no harm in idolizing. That's important. It's important to have role models, but objectively watch the game and come to your own conclusions, and have your own personality to it. Because you're not going to be better. You're not going to be a better Chovy than Chovy is. For example, you're not going to be a better Faker than Faker.
Yeah.
We have Fabian.
Yeah. I think, again, a practical thing that I really like is he using gameplay to communicate out of game ideas. I think that's a really good one. So we talked about, he's saying you're so specific with timings when it comes to the game, but you're not specific with timings when it comes to like going to bed. And I would say you can even do more than that if you, as long as you're comfortable with knowledge of both sides, where I would say actually a great way to explain sleep is it's like CSing, where you can make a 5-man shockwave play and it might well win the game anyway. um, regardless of the resources that you built up. But over time, if you consistently build up more resources by you consistently CSing better, it's just always going to pay off. And there's a lot of players who struggle to climb the ladder, and that's a big one. It's almost a meme now, right? Where the coach just says, well, you just need to CS better. And people do go too far with it. But the point is that that can be a way to explain where if you don't take care of your sleep, it's like you're performing in these games with just lower CS. So you just have less resources to do the things that you want to do. And it could be that you can win the game anyway. And it could be that you can make insane plays anyway. And it'll work a few times. But over a long period of games, if you just get more resources in every single game, you will win more games. And over a split, if you just make sure you prioritize your sleep, you get more resources for every single day. You have more attention, you have more energy, any resource you want to talk about. And so finding a way to explain things in terms of the game, I think is really important, because if you look at one individual game, it can be hard to say like, okay, this person should have CS better or worse or whatever. But if you look over 50 games, it makes a massive difference. So finding things like that, I think, can be really useful. And it's not something that I'd considered before. And if I was to be in that position again, it's something that I would really think through. Like, okay, is there a way for us to explain this in context that people will understand and will understand how important it is, but also how it can somehow be a little bit hidden. And again, really what I'm trying to do is just make it as simple as possible. So I can use gameplay to make things as simple as possible. I think that's a great one from Fabian.
Yeah, I think it's so important, right? Like we see so many players know the exact detail of what this rune does, but they can't tell you what TR they need to be on when they come to practice. And it's like it's showing them that everything they've done to reach the level they have in League of Legends, they can do exactly this those same principles, put it towards themselves in their lives, and then not only are they a really good League of Legends player, a really competitive one, but they're also an amazing human being. And you know, you need to be both to be number one of the millions that play this game. And then I believe the most recent episode was with Grant.
Mm. Yeah, I think everyone in an organization is coaching. I like that as an idea. Again, it comes down to this like marginal gains kind of thing that we're trying to aim for, where everyone's helping those around them, but also those below them, and also really those above them as well. You're teaching the people above you how to get the best out of you.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's a big one for me. But then there's a lot of what Grant was talking about, which is maybe less specifically about coaching, but I do think it's just really really important, and the way that you would build a longer term plan and the way that you would try and get people aligned, I think is also really crucial from there. There's another actually, so it's not out yet, but I'll mention Martina as well. So she's the senior performance manager for Overactive Media. So she works across a lot of different games. They're the people who own Mad Lions and that kind of thing as well. Or one of the ownership part of Mad Lions, I guess I should say now. But she's talking about almost sort of Trojan horsing physical development in, where like it has to be fun. It has to be fun and they're moving. She also talks about movement rather than exercise, which I really like. So one of the pillars being we have to just be moving. I think is great because exercise can be a little bit scary as a term, especially if people aren't used to it. So I think that's a really good thing. And then the other thing that she kind of focuses on, she talks a lot about meeting players where they are, and almost simple and done is better than complex and not done, if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily about building the perfect training program for someone. It's about building a program that they will do. And whether that might be, there's no program actually, you just go for a walk every now and again, or we just do some movement together. That's better than here's a super optimized way of doing things.
Mm.
And there's a last one as well, which I've got on my list. I can't remember where exactly it was, but talking with Aplox, the Valorant coach as well. And one of the things that he does, which I think is important, which is almost the next step to making it conscious, is write it down. So he's writing out a book, which is a very difficult task, difficult to keep a book simple and make it actually also cover things. And something that I've seen some books, League of Legends books before, that are just absolutely impenetrable, which is also a problem.
Mm.
So yeah, that's kind of the next step. You make it conscious, and then you work out a way to write it down. And as you write it down, you'll realize that you were you can accidentally give yourself a bit of leeway when you're talking about things or writing it as notes. But as soon as you write it out strictly and actually kind of cover everything, you don't have any leeway. It has to like make sense without you being there. And suddenly you realize that actually there were holes in it, or there were things that you were bending the truth a little bit, just because that's the same as what you're doing. I think when you're making it conscious in your head, your idea is very, very flexible. Then you actually speak about it and you make it conscious and it becomes much less flexible. And then you write it down and it becomes rigid and it has to work. And so that I think is a really important kind of next step. But I mean, as I say, there's so many things from the podcast. It's been so good to just, I come away from every conversation with so many things to think about, and ideas that have almost come from the conversation as well. So there's a lot of them either specifically here or just a lot of the things that have happened, which is more just comes from the space between two people conversing, which I think is really important and really, really amazing. And that's one of the reasons why I love doing this. So yeah, that was quite a long summary of the podcast, but it's been so good to do it.
Well, we'll get you on. Well, I'll come back and interview you again before you get through another 20 podcasts. The next summary is a bit shorter.
Yeah.
I guess now the favorite time, and this is always fun getting to interview you instead of you interviewing others. Quickfire question time. So, who are some of the coaches you have idolized, either now or early in your career?
Yeah, there's so many. Like I said, I think everything that I'm doing, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. I think everything that I'm doing is based on things that other people are doing. One that's always been a big one for me is Sir Dave Brailsford. I've been telling people since 2016 that I want to be the Brailsford of esports, who I think is maybe misunderstood in colloquial circles and in esports quite a lot. And this idea of marginal gains is very misunderstood, I think, in a lot of places. But he's someone that I think is right up there. And recently, it's Razzie Rasmus, and ironically, both of them are not coaches. So Director of Sport of Ineos and Director of Rugby for SA Rugby. But then there's so many. Another one that I'm finding a lot of value in recently is a guy called Vin Zhang, who's a communications coach, which I said in a tweet recently, I think is the area that we are the worst at in esports. There's so many people who seem like they've never worked on their communication skills. And I don't mean communication is in how you talk to people, because I think we're actually better at that, especially than we used to be. And building up that kind of soft skills and personal skills, I think we're better at. But simply getting through a sentence without 100 likes, or being able to choose when to inspire, when to calm, all that kind of thing, are just tools that we don't have access to. So, yeah, I used to say Brailsford and Faraz Sahabi, but now there's too many. So I'll go Brailsford and Razzie as my main two, but hundreds of others.
Perfect. I can't wait to see that. Hundreds of others. You have to list them out in the Google Doc. What's the biggest hardship you've experienced as a coach?
I think there's two things that came to mind. The first one is that when we joined the LEC, and I made loads of mistakes around this as well. But the short version is someone was brought in to be my boss, effectively, who basically disagreed with everything that I stood for and the way I am as a person. And it was really tough. And now I would retroactively look back and describe it as actually really kind of toxic and abusive environment. But at the time, I was just sort of, there was the pressure of it, and then there was the whole thing. And so it's weird. We tried for sort of never believed we would get this team into the LEC. I'd been involved. I was actually Excel's first ever League of Legends coach back in sort of 2014 or something, and then joined the team later for like a year and a half or something before this. And we never thought we would get there. And then we got there, and it was almost like the best news ever. And then when it actually happened, especially with this person coming in, he sort of systematically tried to ruin everything that I was doing. I didn't find out until afterwards that he'd been telling players to ignore what I was telling them to do, but also telling me to keep doing it. Like for me, he was like, oh, you're just not quite getting through to them. Like just keep at it. But to them, he was telling them, ignore what John is saying, ignore what John is telling you to do. You don't have to do it. And I only know that because Mark actually, Cagewell told me afterwards that because he didn't realize that I wasn't told that he was told to ignore me. So that was a big one. And then the other one more recently is the sort of 2022-23 off season. And there's obviously a lot of good things that came from that because I ended up working with coaches more specifically. But I've been working at Solari, and they said to me that they loved the way that I worked and they wanted to build like a longer term thing with me. And then I was also looking at a bunch of very exciting opportunities in the NLC region, including the exact position that I want to do at a massive sports team that was going to be really integrated with the sports team. It was going to be like I was going to get to chat with their coach every day, like the head coach of their major sports team, all this kind of thing, but also be the director of esports for this company. And then Solari changed their minds without telling me. So it went from one conversation, which was like, can we make it so that you don't look anywhere else and just sign with us for 3 years before you even go into off season? And then the next conversation was, we found another coach, which was a bit whiplash. And then the NLC went to an unaccredited ERL without telling anyone. So they found out 12 hours before the announcement went out on Twitter, and it just killed all their business plans. They had like 3 partners lined up to do this all together, and it just all disappeared because suddenly it was a completely different situation. And so suddenly like everything disappeared. And then I just think I'm so against the way companies do off season. So it was like those things and then added into this. And it's just such a stressful time, and the constant ghosting, the constant being really unclear. I end up having after that no interviews at all with a professional organization, which is fine. I don't think I'm owed any interviews or anything. I don't think I'm owed a job. But that was a really, really difficult time, I think, for me as a coach and as a person. And as with always, when you get loads of stress, like physically and all that kind of thing, I got very ill from just all the stress, like basically being built up for so long. But yeah, it was really unlucky, and then just really esportsy. So that's why I'm so publicly against people who are like ghosting. Like if you're messaging with someone or you're talking with someone or you have an interview with someone and then you just don't tell them anything because you're scared of, it's just being childish. Like you're scared of having a conversation where you just say, we're going to go with someone else. But just, for anyone listening to this, grow up. Every time you move a set of people forward for a job, tell everyone who you're not moving forward. So if you're doing CVs first and then you take forward 10 candidates, whoever sent a CV and isn't one of those 10 candidates, send them an email. Thanks for your application. We're going to go a different way. It's really not difficult. And then just at every stage. But there's people who've had interviews at places and then just get ghosted, and then you see on Twitter that someone else got the job. That's wrong and immoral and evil as far as I'm concerned. And I already thought that, but this tough time kind of made it even more so.
Yeah, it's definitely an esports moment. I think the other day while I was on holiday, I heard back from someone I messaged at the start of 2023 asking if I could come and intern for the organization. They said, "Oh, sorry, we never got back to you, but obviously we filled the position." I think I figured that one out a year and a half later.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think.
But
Yeah, it's one thing when it's like people replying to messages, because I think we should be better at replying to messages, like unknown messages. I think you should just put out some time in your day where you check your emails and reply to emails. But even for me, even more so, people who you are already in conversation with. If you've taken someone for the first stage of interviews and you've talked to them for an hour, and then you ghost them, that for me is, I can't use a strong enough word for it, like sinful or however you want to describe it. Like that's evil. That's got nothing to do with just poor business practice.
Yeah. I guess to sweeten the tone, what's your top highlight as a coach, and then I guess as a coach developer?
That's good, actually. I hadn't thought about specifically as a coach developer. So probably the top highlight was actually when we joined the LEC, before I realized the turn that it was going to take. It was just such an incredible sort of few weeks where it looked like it was when we started, one of the owners even said, "We're not going to get this, but it's going to be a great thing to go through this application to actually make what we didn't know we were doing is making it conscious and write down." Okay, so I wrote with the head coach, we wrote the performance section, and then um, with the social media manager, we wrote the media section. So I ended up writing or being part of writing sort of 80 pages of this 120-page document or something like that. And it was really fun to do. And it was, the whole point was, yeah, we're not going to get this, but it'll be fun. And then suddenly it looked like, well, actually there's a bit of a chance. And then it just kept spiraling. So that was a big one. There's of course like a few tournament wins, which were great, great to have, but to be honest, maybe not as big. And then actually, yeah, joining the LEC because we also got some feedback that it was on the basis of our really strong performance section, and they said we wouldn't have got it without that. And we wrote a bunch of stuff, which the way that I would go about getting it is very different from what it was in 2018 or whenever we wrote it. But the things, the area that we're aiming for is still the same. We talked about developing the whole athlete. We talked about working with universities to get people degrees so that when they're done, they also have a degree, and all these kind of things, which I'm still very much in favor of, although the way we actually got there will be different. Then in terms of a coach developer, I think, to be honest, it's rather than a specific moment, although there's almost nothing better than when you see something click in someone's head, either something that I'm trying to teach them or even it just clicks from the conversation. So I love all those moments. But I've just been, I consider myself lucky enough to be in a situation where the feedback that I've got has just been so humbling and unbelievable. And I think that's a lot due to the fact that we're so starved for this kind of coach development. But just some of the things that people have said about what the experience was or messaged me about it, like, none of this would be possible without what we're doing together and all this kind of thing. And it's like this is one of the closest relationships I have now. And like all this kind of stuff is just really humbling and great to be a part of.
Yeah, I think that works both ways, right? Like as a coach or a coach developer, just when you're working with someone and they grasp the idea, no matter
Mm.
the journey, it must be really satisfying. What are the three non-negotiable behaviors that people around you need to buy into?
Mm. The first one for me is they're kind of all connected, but the first one for me is actually just punctuality. I like to have some of these are a bit vague, but some of them are specific because for me it shows respect and all this kind of thing. Like I'm going to take this seriously. And the next one would be kind of commitment, which I think is a really, really big one. That's a bit more broad. And in a sense, if they're committed, they will be on time. So they all do all sort of feed to each other. But I think that is better than thinking about in terms of hardworking, because as soon as we're talking about hardworking, we're now talking about most likely we're talking about hours and stuff like that. But when I'm saying commitment, it encompasses that kind of marginal gains type idea as well. Because if you're really committed to being the best at something and someone comes to you with an idea you haven't thought of, it should be excitement is your first emotion rather than cynicism and anger, because it is an opportunity to do something better. Maybe this feedback is right. Maybe actually the wheel's not straight, if we go back to that same example. So that commitment, I think, is a really, really big one. And then the last I would say is honesty, which I would define as your actions. You say what you do and you do what you say. I really believe that we are what we do, not what we say we'll do. And I believe as well there's no such thing as deep down. I think you can't be like, deep down I'm committed, but my actions are not committed. Like that's not, you are what you do. So that's a really big one for me. So it would be punctuality, honesty, and commitment to the cause.
Yeah, I love those. And then to wrap this up is if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that be?
I think I'm going to cheat and give myself more than one piece of advice, but probably actually the most useful piece of advice would be to realize that to grow up and realize that marketing yourself and being public is actually part of it. I used to never do anything publicly because I just told myself and other people that I'm going to coach well and that will be enough. I'm going to do my job well. And the people that I've coached, again, said incredibly nice things about coaching with me, and that's how I got most of the jobs that I got, because they then got me into the next job. But until I joined Solari, I literally didn't have a social media or anything, didn't have a Leaguepedia page. I mean, Leaguepedia didn't even exist when I started coaching, but even when it started to exist, I didn't get myself a page. So it was even a joke when I was working with Josh. There's a picture where we won an event at Insomnia, and they give you a big check, and there's like a picture and an article about it where we're all on stage holding the check. And I'm not a small person. I'm 6'5". I'm like, at the time I was quite heavy as well. Like I was 100 kg or whatever, 6'5". And I know I'm in the picture because I know I was holding up the check. I remember doing that, but I cannot see myself. I can see everyone else, and I'm somehow disappeared. It was like our joke, which again was kind of fine. But now I talk to people that, like, I've coached the team that played against them or beat them, and they didn't even realize, or they talked to me. I mean, I had an interview on the NLC once where someone was saying, "How does it feel to finally be a head coach?" And I'd be like, I was head coach for 4 years. Like because it was still a while ago. I was head coach for like 4 years. I won tournaments that you cast, and no one knew. And I was just it was just an excuse, really, because it's work to do it. Like, yes, it can be fun, but it's work to do it. And it was really an excuse that I was saying, like, no, I don't believe in all that. I believe that we should hire people because they're the right person for the job and they're a great coach. And that's true. But, like, how are they going to know who you are, and how are they going to know if you're a good coach unless you do anything around that? So even though now I market myself a lot more, still probably not enough, but a lot more, it's something I never did, and it's definitely been massively detrimental to my career, and I could have just done it. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, because the other ones that I had written down we've kind of already covered, like think things through, and I really echo something that several people have said when it comes to this question, which is kind of trust your gut, because you to capitulate to other people, you still might get blamed and still might get fired. There's a Jim Carrey speech which I really like. He's talking about his dad, who always wanted to be a writer and instead got a job in an accountancy firm or something, which he hated, but was like the stable, safe job. And then in either 2008 or a different recession, he was made redundant, and he never got a job again or something like that. And the way Jim Carrey says it is, I learned lots of important lessons from my father, but the most important lesson is that you can fail at what you don't want to do. So you might as well take a chance on what you do. And I think that's a good thing for a coach, because so often, including at places like Solari, I didn't push my way of doing things, and I let other people do the way that I thought was wrong, but they were the ones in charge, or they were the ones, let myself not do it the way that I want to do it, with the idea of, okay, now if it doesn't work, we both know it was your decision to get these players or to do this thing. And yet, in the end, you're still the one who's responsible as a coach, and you're still the one who is blamed as a coach. And I would say blamed maybe rightfully. And so if you're going to get fired for the decisions, you might as well be the one making the decisions. I think that's also a good piece of advice. But I think I can't remember, maybe GoToOne and Sabatine also said that too. So I think that's another good one.
So then I guess just to summarize and just put the cherry on top of this conversation, I guess my biggest takeaway is moving away is make it conscious. Just be honest to the people, to yourself and the people around you, and then do it with a smile. Because from all the conversations I've been very lucky to have with you, because I remember messaging you and getting in touch when I first started out in esports. That's something that's always remained true. You've always approached every challenge and every good point with a smile, and I think that's something I've learned from you, because coaching is a lonely place and it's a very difficult place, but if you do it with a smile, you'll get through all right.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's that's what it is, So you gotta love it. Otherwise you should be doing something else. So it's the, like, talking to people and all that kind of thing. That is kind of what coaching is. So you let yourself enjoy it is completely fine. But yeah, thanks for doing this. Thanks for having the idea as well, and thanks for letting me talk as well, which I think was really fun to do. Actually, I hadn't hadn't realized just how much I'd taken from this podcast until I started writing things down. So that was really good. Cheers.